He had 17 missed calls by the time the sun remembered to climb past the curtains. The alarm on his phone had been silenced hours ago. The messages stacked like small accusations on the screen. He squinted at a hand that wasn't his across the rumpled sheet, and at the dark hair, fanned like some strange horizon on his pillow. For a moment his mind supplied explanations that were kinder than the truth. A party, a mistake, a drunken misunderstanding. Then memory dropped in short, sharp pieces: the suit he'd left at the hotel dry cleaners, the engagement ring cooling against skin, the wedding in 3 hours. The laughter from upstairs in his own life continued as if nothing could reach the hotel room. Okafor swung his legs out of bed with the practiced composure of a man used to making things happen. The woman rolled onto her side. She blinked, as if waking from a dream. There was a scattered, helpless intelligence in the way she picked up her clothes because she did not know which ones belonged to her and which had been taken for some other morning. For Adana Okonku, the morning arrived in fragments, blank space, where the night should have been. The taste of metal at the edge of her mouth, a name she couldn't remember, and a hotel keycard clipped with a label from a room she didn't recognize. "Who are you?" Cheek demanded, and it landed like a blow. His voice carried the wealth of a family accustomed to obedience, the sudden edge of panic and reputation. Her eyes opened wider. For the first time she tried to put her own life next to his, and discovered there was no bridge. She reached for a word and found only the echo of a possibility her memory could not furnish. When he laughed, it was not with humor. He fumbled for his wallet, for the hard currency of a world that believed money could erase moments. He threw a thick envelope across the bed so it scattered like a clumsy apology over sheets that had been wrongfully shared. "Take this. Go. Don't make a scene. I have a wedding." The words were automatic, practiced for the convenience of other people's problems. He gathered a suit from the chair and shoved it into Adana's hands with the same flippant cruelty he used when dismissing a broken vase. She looked at the paper, felt the tremor in her own fingers. The hotel's air smelled of lemon cleaner and nerves. Outside the curtains, the city was beginning its business as if nothing had happened. Taxis, the hum of generators, life moving according to plan. Adna dressed without believing the garments were meant for her. On her wrist. After the frantic taxi ride and the wrong names and the taximeter and the exchange of money she would later not remember, someone had left a hospital bracelet, white plastic, stamped with a date and a name. She kept it folded in her palm like a small, secretable truth, but she didn't know why. The wedding was a theater of light and careful smiles, silken pearls, cameras fluttering like birds. Cheek arrived late, but unbowed, his face set in a way that could pass for attention to duty. His mother, Chief Mrs. Okafor, had a face that knew the economy of shame and the bank of reputation. She had adopted the expression of someone who had learned to trade tenderness for control. Behind her eyes was a calculation. Public scandal cost less than the slow erosion of power. "It must go on," she told her advisers in the hush between vows. "We do not fold for gossip." Adana watched from a distance the way the ceremony succeeded in pretending. Guests clinked cups as if the morning had not been troubled, and the music was a benevolent claim against a private ruin. She sat with her palms folded, the envelope heavy in her bag, trying to anchor memory to details she could trust. The smell of jasmine at the altar, the clink of ice in a glass, a stray child's laughter that seemed to belong to another country. Nobody asked her how she felt. In the wealthy world, feelings were lubricants for transactions, and she was not a participant. Later that day she returned to the small house her grandmother had kept for them on the edge of town. The compound was an economy of modest pleasures. Plantains frying in oil, a wooden stool darkened by years of elbows, an old radio muttering gospel music. Her grandmother, who would later say she read people like open palms, sat across from her with an expression that was nothing if not steady. "Tell me everything," she said, as if story and truth were the same. Adana told what she could remember. Pieces held each other like reluctant relatives at a family funeral. The morning blurred. There were holes where someone might have filled her with something that muffled the shape of events. She found herself saying a word she would later say with too much frequency. Drugged. The word sat on the table and looked like an accusation that needed witnesses. Her grandmother pressed a sachet of shea butter into Edna's hand, small, cooling, smelling of simpler suns, and said, "Come with me. We will leave." There were negotiations that smelled of humiliation, calls she could not answer. A signature on a passport hurried like a verdict. The Okafor family lawyers making arrangements with the kind of efficiency that leaves no trace of compassion. On the same day Edna was flown to Houston, the Okafors received a newborn at a hospital in Lagos. The child was cooed and wrapped and officially, carefully welcomed into a household that wanted to erase scandal with airs and affection. The paperwork said the child had come to them by adoption. The incubator photograph slid into an album of affairs of state and succession. In Houston, at the fictional St. Augustine Medical Center, Dr. Martinez stood at the head of a bed and read the room the way some doctors read scripture. Adonis Labo did not feel like a story anymore. It felt like a thin thread pulled through hands that had to be steady. A nurse with a kind, quick manner handed her a hospital bracelet. The bracelet was stamped with a date and a 6-digit number and a name that would be signed by clerks and then archived. The baby, they told her, had not drawn breath. Stillborn, the papers would say. A clinical word, like a shutter being closed. Edna's grief was immediate and immaculate in its privateness. She curled her arms as if to hold what was not there. People promised explanations, but they were explanations in the language of convenience, forms to be signed, a referral to counseling, e polite condolence. Someone suggested return flights and a life to rebuild. Someone else suggested silence. The Okafor's adoption proceeded the same week, a neat solution to a family's need for continuity. When she asked questions about dates and hospitals and names, the answers were procedural and small paperwork complete, files filed, signatures scanned. Edna kept the hospital bracelet in her palm under the sheets of her rented room, like a tiny altar. 5 years passed. The country changed faces under her feet. Edna's hair, threaded with silver, at the temples of worry, with the same stubbornness that had kept the little house's lights on through the lean summers. She rebuilt herself with the careful labor of someone who had learned to value small truths. Her grandmother's voice was a constant. "You will plant something that will grow," she said once, when Edna was near to giving up. "Roots don't always show at the surface. They look for water in the dark." When she returned to Nigeria, she did not expect to find herself in a mansion whose gates glimmered with a family name embroidered across towels. The Okafor house was the sort of place that smelled of lemon polish and low-toned Poweran exchequer of staff. A bank for social capital. Mr. D'Angema, the head of domestic staff, met her at the kitchen door with the look of a man who had to keep many plates spinning. "We need someone steady with children," he said. "Someone who will not be noticed." Elisha was 5 years old, the first morning she met him. He appeared in the doorway as if conjured by the sound of a soft whistle, hair in prickled coils, trousers a little too long, eyes like 2 small inspections of the world. He had a toy car with a missing wheel that he kept in his hand as if it were currency. He was nervous with a thin white thread under his appetite. It would tell you he loved toy cars and peanut butter and being alone at night. The staff called him Master Elijah because that was how the household made narratives stick. But when he saw Edna, he did not bow. He sat down, cross-legged on the floor, and patted the spot near him like a small king inviting a tenant. "Sit," he said. And she did. Something in the way he unwrapped the toy car to show her the missing wheel, small fingers, handled like a magician's trick, softened a part of her that had been hard from surviving. He talked fast and in fragments. Facts about trains and engines he'd convinced himself were important. Questions about whether Auntie Ada, which is how he named her after 10 days, liked carrots or cows. "My mommy says Auntie Ada is good at making jollof rice," he declared once with the naive certainty of a child who had learned to trade truth for comfort. Little observations like those seeded their days. She brought lunchboxes with fried plantain and peanut butter sandwiches patched with love and a sachet of shea butter folded into her pocket for his dry hands. Elijah learned to trust the small rituals of hygiene. The way she smoothed his hair before bed, the way she bought the band-aids, he adored. He asked for stories, and she invented ones about seed and root, about how a small thing put in the soil could, if tended, become a tree. When he climbed into bed, she would tell him about a girl who had planted a garden despite neighbors. scorn and about how the garden always returned the kindness it was given. The household staff watched the change in the way an audience watches a subtler drama unfold. Mr. Li, who had served 5 different family heads, would occasionally let a small observation fall like a polished pebble. "You look like you belong here," he said to Adana once. Not as compliment, but as acknowledgement. Mrs. Okafor tolerated her as if tolerance were some shade of generosity. Cheek, when he returned on business trips, noticed the quiet revolution that had taken place in a corner of his house. His presence at first was like a question mark, clipped. Professional visits to check on the child. Not yet the long gaze of a man rethinking his life. Elijah's choice was not a dramatic proclamation so much as a quiet tilt of his small heart toward hers. One evening, after she'd bandaged the toy car and fixed a dinner with an extra slice of plantain, he leaned against her knee and whispered, "I want you to be my real mommy." The phrase landed like a seed. Adana felt something in her chest loosen, and then tighten, joy braided with the ache of absence. She did not answer with promises she could not keep. Instead, she kissed his brow, the way one tends fragile shoots. That he had chosen her was what the household would later remember when they told the story in enough detail to be interesting. That choice was the human truth. The title of the narrative would later compress into a headline. The son chose the maid. For Adana it was simply a pivot. For Cheek it was a splinter in the glass of social certainty he wore. Cheek's curiosity shifted into a current. He began to find reasons to linger in the house. Calls that extended into coffee at the private suite in the family's study. Excuses about business strategies that brought him to Elijah's room when the child was asleep. Where entitlement had once been his armor, now there was a nervousness he could not quite name. He watched the way Elijah reached for Adana's hand, saw the exhalation in the child's face when she sang a lullaby she had made up. The house, which had been a machine for preserving appearances, showed signs of strain. Late one night, Cheek sat on the veranda looking at the city lights and thought about the morning he had woken with a stranger in his bed. He had closed that chapter with currency and a shrug, because he believed coins could buy silence, but the world is not so generous with second chances. The morning had birthed consequences like weeds. The sensation of being watched by his family's own past made him restless. He hired a private investigator, not out of vengeance, but from the quieter need to know. Had the scandal been as tidy as it looked? The pie, a woman named Ifeoma, with contacts and a compiler's mind, began to comb through the thin places where official stories meet chance. Ifeoma's office smelt of coffee and paper. She worked like an archaeologist who had learned to find bones in the dust of bureaucracy. She mentioned Dr. Martinez as if the name might be a thread, like an address that echoes across time. In the documents she pulled out were dates, hospital codes, a hospital bracelet number that matched another file. She found a birth entry for Adana's stillborn baby at St. Augustine Medical Center in Houston on the same date as the newborn entry in the Okafor adoption file back home. The match wasn't proof. It was a hand closing around curiosity. A signature in both files Dr. Martinez's showed in different scrawls, like the same signature spilled across 2 worlds. Cheek's reaction was not cinematic chest beating. It was a slow collapse of certainties. He sat in his car and reread Ifeoma's notes. She had done what she did best. She presented facts like breadcrumbs. "There's overlap," she said. "Dates? The same doctor?" The paperwork look she didn't finish because she didn't want to move into speculation. Cheek felt something in the middle of him that had been armored up for the public's gaze, now open like a wound. The past was arriving at his door. The man who had thrown money in a hotel room thought of the child who had chosen Adana and felt the strange dissidence of private moral gravity. The household bristled with undercurrents now. Mrs. Okafor grew tighter and less gracious, as if the castle might be stormed by the slow tide of truth. Mr. D'Angelo watched the adults like a man watching weather patterns. "Don't stand in the open when lightning is expected." Cheek began to ask questions in small, precise ways. He sat at the kitchen table and watched Adana slice tomatoes. "When did you have your baby?" he asked once, trying to alchemize a conversation from commonplace. She answered with measured calm. She had learned to be careful with dates, with how she placed her grief in the room. Then the emergency arrived, like something that bypasses all plans. It came on a night of false peace, when Elijah was building a track of toy cars across the living room floor. He stepped on the wrong piece of the carpet, tripped, sat down, and put his head in his hands. At first, the complaint was soft stomach pain, nothing dramatic. Only when the color left his face and his eyes rolled in a way that made the room tilt did the staff understand the depth of danger. The household moved from domestic choreography to something else. Phone numbers exchanged. A rush to the car, a siren of panic that did not entirely leave anybody afterward. At St. Augustine, at its Lagos affiliate, a private pediatric facility, the family trusted the doctors said phrases that sounded clinical but bore the weight of life. Acute kidney failure, rapid deterioration. They explained the likely causes in a language that was kindly and blunt. There are causes that range from infection to a congenital issue, one doctor said. We need dialysis and tests. We need a donut if the condition progresses. The words made the air crack. The Okafor staff, spacious and efficient, now felt like a society whose currency did not include answers to grief. Cheek, summoned from a meeting, felt the brittle edge of panic take him by the shoulders. He had been practiced at making things happen. Now, he could not. Adana sat in a plastic visitor's chair and pressed the little hospital bracelet to her mouth as if it were a charm. The room smelled of disinfectant and the faint medicinal temps that lives in hospitals like a second language. Elisha lay small and pale under a blanket whose tag had the hospital's name sewn in like a signature. The child's cheeks were hollow, and his fingers, always busy, like small remeras, were slack. This is bad, the doctor said without melodrama. If the kidneys are failing, we will need to stabilize him with dialysis. We will run a full panel. We will also look for possible donors. The closer the genetic match, the better the outcomes. Adana thought of the hospital bracelet she had kept folded in a book in her suitcase years ago, as if preserving a secret you'd rather not own. She thought of the toy car with the missing wheel in the child's hand, and how he had chosen her. The idea that had nested in her for years surfaced with a clarity that surprised her. She could be a donor. There are legal and ethical boxes to check. The surgeon would have to explain risks. Consent forms would have to be signed. She understood the gravity, but also understood something else that made the decision almost a kind of instinct. He had asked her, "Real mommy?" And 2 days ago that phrase would have been sweet and private. Now it weighed like a compass. Would I be eligible to be tested? She asked quietly. The doctor regarded her with professional caution. We can run a cross-match test. It tells us about abo compatibility and tissue markers. We do not proceed without explicit informed consent and counseling about risks. And I should be clear, even if you match, transplant surgery carries real risks. That word explicit informed structured the moment into an ethical frame. They took blood in tubes that smelled of antiseptic and iron. The hours stretched like old cloth. Cheek paced hospital corridors with a kind of sleepiness around his eyes. He had known panic in the sense of lost contracts and public events gone wrong. He had not known it as a moral imperative. Call me if anything, he told the doctor as if he could buy fate with presents. He sat in a neon-lit waiting room that had banners about organ donation he had never read as anything more than PR. Now the words on the posters were knives. When the test results came back, they did not arrive as poetry. They arrived as numbers and abbreviations, as charts and a nurse's careful footnotes, but the clarity of the thing hammered through every cautious syllable. Perfect match. The team explained what that meant without making promises. The match improved chances for a successful transplant. But surgery always came with risk. They needed written, informed consent. There would be counseling, pre-op tests, time on dialysis, referral to a transplant surgeon. The bureaucratic kindness of hospitals has a way of keeping drama small and systematic. Cheek's reaction was not immediate. He had been part of a world that could summon blood and money with equal ease. Yet the presence of a woman from the margin, someone they had allowed into the house for her steadiness, up and being the match for his adopted child, produced a noise inside him that could not be paid off. He thought of the envelope he had thrown across the bed years ago, the way the luxury of a life had been used to erase an inconvenient morning. He thought of the family album where the child's face had been positioned like an heirloom. He thought of the quiet courage in the expression on Adena's face as she listened to the doctor explain risks. Mrs. Okafor needs to sign off, the surgeon told them. We will need the legal guardian's consent for the transplantation. There are forms, a psychiatric evaluation, to ensure that the donor understands what is required, and a cooling-off period to confirm volume. A small meeting unfolded. A choreography that had the feel of an orchestra tuning for a performance. Mrs. Okafor arrived in a silk scarf that had the birth of cold. Her first concern was not grief but propriety. She asked questions of procedure with the brisk competence of someone who knows how institutions bend. Mr. D'Angema hovered as a steady hand. Cheek's eyes moved between the doctors and the woman, in a plain dress, who had once been the subject of a merciless mourning and now sat like a pillar, listening to Risk explained out loud. "Are you sure?" Mrs. Okafor asked Adana, but the question was less about medical facts and more about the fragile concept of sacrifice crossing class lines. The room was suddenly full of a variety of judges, some in fine cloth, some in hospital scrubs, all trying to understand what it meant. Adana thought of the toy car, of its missing wheel, of the fact that the child had chosen her. She thought of a grandmother's hands and the small, honest work of tending life. She heard the surgical risks, explained like a line of weather. She had not been sainted. She had felt anger at those who had dismissed her, fear of losing more than she had already lost. Yet, when she said, yes, it was a clarity that did not taste like martyrdom. It tasted like the thing she had been doing all along, caring. She signed forms with a steadiness that was not bravado, but resolution. The surgeon, a man with practiced kindness, named Dr. Musa, explained the process. Pre-op tests, cross-matching confirmation, a consent form for surgery, timelines, and the need for someone to be legally recognized as giving consent for the child to undergo transplant. Cheek's name was on the legal documents as the guardian. He had to sign acknowledgement. He did so with a hesitation that everyone saw. The signature felt less like a formality and more like an admission that family could be chosen and that the house he had inherited contained contradictions that money could not fix. While the medical team readied for surgery, Ifeoma, the PA, left a message that splintered the sterile air. She had found more documents. Cheek took the call in the corridor where the hospital's hum was a constant. There were photocopies and original files carried across oceans, copies of Dr. Martinez's notes, hospital wristband numbers, dates. The PI's voice on the phone was careful. I have records, she said. I won't make allegations. I'm only a finder of documents. But there's too much overlap to ignore. Same dates, same doctor, similar bracelet numbers. She sent a scanned packet. Cheek sat down on an empty bench and opened the email like a slow-motion act. He found a scanned page, a hospital bracelet number from St. Augustine, a delivery record, a nurse's shorthand. He found another printout, a certificate of adoption filed in Lagos with an entry time that matched, within hours, the Houston delivery record. The documents looked like evidence only in that they refused to be tidy. There was a name in the document, Sadhanath, that inscribed a ghost across the records. The thing was not proved in courts. Not yet. It was a pressure point, a gatherable suspicion, a paper-constricting possibility. He held the phone with papers in the other hand and felt like a man whose life had been built on a table of cards and now had a child in the house who had chosen a woman without the family knowing the edges of their own history. Someone else sat on the bench across from him. Mr. D'Angema, whose face had learned to keep storms small. He did not ask questions. He offered a small pragmatism. Do what is right for the child, he said. The rest can be sorted. Children are the truth of a house. In the operating theater, the team moved with the morphing grace of people used to urgent tenderness. The pre-op room smelled of lemon disinfectant and resolve. The legalities were checked, consent forms signed, psychiatric evaluation noting voluntariness, the donor's blood typed and matched twice. A surgeon explained the possible complications in terms that did not minimize reality. Bleeding, infection, the possibility the graft might not function. They spoke of outcomes in percentages and then softened them with the human fact that statistics belong to people who keep watching their fortunes. At the edge of the operating room, Sheik was asked to sign one last form, acknowledging the surgical consent for Elisha. He hesitated, then signed with a hand that had been used to contracts, but not to confessions. He realized, with a strange, new humility, that whether or not the paperwork and the PI's documents had the force of legal truth, the child who had chosen Adana needed someone to act. Outside the theater, Ifeoma left another printed page with Mr. D'Anjuma, a photograph of a hospital blanket tag, smudged and creased, with a code that matched an item in the Okafor adoption file. It was not proof beyond doubt. It was a hand on a door in the night. The PI had herself been careful to include a note. These are leads, not final judgments, but the coincidence folded into a shape that demanded scrutiny. The head nurse, seeing the set of documents, felt a cold press in her chest. Wherever privilege meets chance, there is a mirror. Adana lay on a low cot in a pre-op suite, pale but steady. Elijah had been taken to a pediatric intensive care bed that would be his world for now. The maternal bond in the room was not biological in the crude sense the newspapers would later try to pin on it. It was a thing built of days, and shared food and late-night stories. Of being the person to sit while the child cried, and not leaving. The surgeons were serious and professional. There were no dramas here except those of pure human risk. The anesthesia nurse explained to Adana in gentle terms what to expect and asked if she had questions. She shook her head and thought of a grandmother's kitchen and a toy car and a woman who had once been shoved from a hotel room into exile. The moment before she was taken to the operating theater, the surgeon asked, "Are you absolutely certain of your decision? You are free to withdraw. We have to confirm there is no coercion." She thought of the money he had thrown in a room as if currency could erase guilt. She thought of a child's small hand and the way it had clung to a patched toy. "Yes," she said, "I'm certain." They closed her in sterile blue. The surgical lights were cold and enormous. The world shrank to notes of anesthesia and the rhythm of a heart monitored in beeps. Down the corridor, Cheek watched the minutes like someone seeing numbers on a screen and understanding that the weight of a life could not be dressed with more wealth. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with another message from Ifeoma, another photograph. He opened it and found what looked like a scanned hospital record with a name and a delivery time and a handwritten margin note that read, "In Dr. Martinez's slanted hand. Case transferred, family request." The phrase raised ceilings of suspicion. Back in the operating room, the team worked with practiced focus. The surgical rhythm had nothing to do with theatrics. It was a choreography of small, impeccable acts performed under pressure. The anesthetist watched the monitors and told jokes in a soft voice to keep the human animal awake even when chemically subdued. The surgeon worked with hands that had steadied many lives, and the scrub nurse passed instruments with a language that required no translation. At the same instant, in a small office at the hospital, Ifeoma and a clerk compared notes. There was a copy of a bracelet number, scanned and labeled, and a receipt stamped with a Houston hospital code that matched the delivery sheet. The Kluka man who had once handled hospital files in the hush of enlistments said, "You can build a theory out of these, but you'll need a chain." Ifeoma nodded. "We have threads," she said. "The rest is a matter of finding the knot." In a parallel seam, Mrs. Okafor stood in the corridor with folded hands. Her family face was like a shield. Inside it, the war of preserving a legacy and protecting a child raged. Cheek, who had taught himself a posture of quiet deference to his mother, was hollowed by an unfamiliar grief. He had never known what it meant to watch a child in pain and not be able to conjure a fix with money alone. Standing at the edge of the theater, he called a number and left a message for the family lawyer. "Hold everything. No public statements. Secure the records." In the moment before the surgeon closed the incision on Adana's side, a nurse rolled in a small manila envelope. It contained a photocopy of an old hospital wristband. Its numbers matched in a careful list. The nurse who delivered it looked at the surgeon with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and unease. "From the documents room," she said. "Someone requested copies. News leaks in hospitals in different forms than in tabloids. It travels as paper, as a whisper, as a look shared between nurses." The surgeon placed the envelope on the table and did not allow it to disturb the sterile line. Outside, Ifeoma's emails were forming their own web. When they wheeled Adana into recovery, Cheek's legs were wobbly, and the hospital tasted like metal and prayer. He saw the child's face on the monitor puffed and small, and a hand he had once used to sign checks now trembled. The surgery had an outcome only partially in anyone's control. The graft either took or it didn't. The match improved chances, but nothing was certain. The PI's envelope sat on the surgeon's desk, and then, as if bold, a copy was handed to Cheek. He unfolded the Xerox of dates and signatures like a contract that had rewritten itself. Adana, still under medication, lay small and breathing in the controlled pace post-op. Elijah's numbers on the chart flickered like a radar searching for a signal. When the surgeon finally wheeled Elijah out of theater hours later, duct-taped in tubes, and a small hospital blanket tagged with a code that chimed with Ifeoma's documents, Cheek felt something crack like ice. The child's chest rose and fell in a tide that suggested the surgeon's work had a chance. The family exhaled as if the body were a debt finally paid. The news from the doctors was measured. The graft seemed to be there would be recovery, there would be physiotherapy, there would be future tests. The future, like the recovered patient, came in stages. Cheek sat at the foot of the child's bed and watched the small chest settle. He thought of the morning in which money had been thrown, like a dismissal, across a bed. He thought of the woman who had become a necessary miracle, and also a question his family might prefer to ignore. He folded the photocopy of the documents with fingers that felt clumsy, and then slipped them into a drawer. Paper can be dangerous if it is shown widely. It can be more dangerous if it is hidden and allowed to fester. Later, late in the night, after a day of hospital vigil, Ifeoma adjusted her glasses and said to Cheek in the small light of the corridor, "You need to decide what you want to do with these leads." The papers were not verdicts. They were catalysts. There are questions you can ask. There are people you can subpoena. There are names to check. But be careful. This deals with grief. And with a child's life. It is not merely a matter of proving an inconvenient truth. He carried the documents home as if they were a confession he had to live with. They did not bring answers, but they did bring pressure. Dates that overlapped, bracelets that matched codes, a name Dr. Martinez scribbled in files on both sides of the Atlantic. The picture being painted was not neat. It hinted at a hand that may have shifted a child between rooms, or at a bureaucracy that had allowed things to happen at the edges. The PI had not arrived at conclusions. She had arranged evidence into the shape of suspicion and then left it on his lap like a torch. What would happen? Everyone in the house began to ask in different ways. Mrs. Okafor wanted to protect the child. She wanted to protect the family's image. Mr. D'Angelo wanted an end to the friction. The staff wanted normalcy. Adana wanted the child's life to continue. Cheek wanted the truth, if only because truth, once known, is the only possible base for moral acts. He had thrown money at people years ago. Now, money could not undo what choices had made. He could choose to hide the papers and keep his life untroubled, or he could choose to hold the child's hand through what might be a storm. Adana, when she finally woke properly in the recovery room and saw Elijah sleeping soundly in a cot by the bed and clasped his small hand and felt the warm, unreasonable throb of relief, did not think of the documents. She thought of his breath, of the way the toy car lay on the blanket, and of the simple, human fact that a child who loved her had been given a chance. That alone was its own kind of answer. She pressed her forehead to his fingers like a prayer. In the quiet after the storm, the house settled into a new arrangement of truths. The child's choice, Elijah's insistence that Adana be his real mommy, was a gentle gravity toward which people bent. The photographs in the album would not tell the whole story. The papers in the drawer were not a verdict yet, but a pressure point that would require courage to follow. Cheek, who had once used money and reputation to quiet the world, now found himself unsure how to proceed morally. He had to decide whether to expose an inconvenient truth to a world that valued stories with clean endings. Outside the hospital, the city turned like a coin. Small things stayed true. The smell of shea butter when Adana smoothed Elijah's hair. The toy car with its missing wheel that he insisted on carrying, Mr. D'Angelo's steady presence in the background. Inside, a family stood at the edge of revelation with a private detective's file on the table and a hospital bracelet in a drawer. The entire arc felt like the movement of a seed, a past buried and a root finding its way toward light. As night gave way to a fragile dawn, Cheek sat with Ifeoma and the photocopies and felt the weight of what the papers suggested. The documents hinted at a story that might change everything. That the child his household had called adopted may have been born to a woman whose life had been hushed and sent away. It was the kind of truth that could shatter reputations and, at the same time, give clarity. But the clarity had a cost: social, legal, and moral. The question was no longer merely who had been right and wrong in a hotel room years ago. It was whether repairing a wrong could be done without harming the people who had become irreplaceable along the way. In a brief, quiet moment, Elijah woke. He opened his eyes and blinked at the fluorescent light like a small creature surprised at being remembered. He reached for Edna with a thin, reflexive hunger for comfort, and she leaned across him and kissed the small knuckles of his hand. His breath came easier. The monitors chimed like a small choir. He looked at her and said, the phrase that had already rearranged the house, "You came back." She smiled the way someone smiles when the world has given you a bone after a long hunger. It was not a smile of triumph, but of simple, human victory. A child alive and reaching. He had chosen her. The papers in Cheek's drawer glinted like possible violence on a horizon, but for now the immediate present held the child's small hand and the warmth of breath. In the hallway, Cheek folded the photocopies and put them into a manila envelope as if tucking something back into winter. He did not know yet whether he would open them to the light. He had a child's life in his hands and his family history on paper. At midnight, he stood with his mother outside the ice, and they watched the small room where the truth and the tender now lay together. Her voice was not sharp now. It was a cautious, human thing. Whatever the papers say, this child is ours until proven otherwise. He thought of the hotel sheets, of the envelope he had thrown, of the long road that had led them to a hospital corridor with a child in need and a woman ready to give. He felt exposed, humbled, as if his hand had been revealed in a tableau where his choices had consequences his wealth could not erase. The pie, respectful and quietly relentless, left them with the documents, dates, the name Dr. Martinez, Houston Hospital records, cross-checked with adoption paperwork in Lagos. She had not announced conclusions. She had only given possibility a body. "You asked me to look," she said. "There are leads. There is a chain. You must decide if you wish to follow it." Cheek sat in the car as dawn softened the city. Elijah's toy car rested on the seat beside him, its missing wheel a small emblem of survival. He felt an odd kind of gratitude in the absurdity of the situation. A maid who had once been tossed from his life had now risked her body for the child he raised. The headline-thinking world might say that the son had chosen the maid, but the truth in the room was more complicated, more human, and therefore more crushing. The child had chosen her, and the resulting choices anyone made from that point would shape lives. There would be questions, legal procedures, and possibly courtroom battles that would try to convert messy human history into black and white facts. But at that moment, in the hush between surgeries and photocopies, the undeniable thing was simple. A child had been given a chance because someone loved him enough to offer a piece of herself. For Adana, for Elisha, for Cheek. This was the beginning of a reckoning that would demand more than money or reputation to navigate. And the truth would not be a single moment of revelation, but a slow unspooling. Documents to be examined, witnesses to be interviewed, motives to be parsed. The PI's file could be opened by lawyers, or it could be shoved into a drawer and forgotten. But paper has inertia. It insists on being read eventually. The title of this story of the sensational claim that a billionaire's son had chosen a maid was true in its way. A child he loved had chosen Adana as caretaker, and she had now risked herself for that child's life. What he found out next? The paper trail that might connect the child's adoption to Adana's loss. The name of a doctor. A matching bracelet number was the beginning of a deeper shock that would force them all to rewrite the story they had told themselves for years. As the first light of morning broadened into a thin, exact day, the hospital quieted. Nurses whispered about recovery timetables. Machines continued their steady chant. In the corner, a small toy car rolled unnoticed and stopped against the foot of a bed, as if to say that despite the paperwork, the laws, The questions. The first loyalty was not two headlines but two small hands. If you want to know what happens when the records are followed, when copies of scanned bracelets and signatures from distant hospital rooms are brought into the clinical light and the family must reckon with what those papers suggest, subscribe and follow the next episode. This is not only about scandal, it's about what people are willing to do to protect a child's life and what they are willing to risk to find out whether a child belongs to them by blood or by love.